Captain Sarah Chen stepped out of the military transport vehicle, her boots hitting the dusty ground of forward operating base Phoenix with a solid thud. The Afghan sun blazed overhead, making the desert air shimmer like water. Around her, soldiers went about their daily routines, but she could feel their eyes following her every move. Whispers followed in her wake, though they thought she couldn't hear them. "Great, another diversity hire," muttered Sergeant Miller to his buddy near the ammunition depot. "Bet she's never seen real combat." Sarah had heard it all before. At 28, she was one of the youngest captains in her battalion, and certainly one of the few women in a combat leadership role. Her journey to this remote outpost in Helmand Province hadn't been easy. Growing up in a small town in Ohio, she'd always been the odd one out. While other girls played with dolls, Sarah was building model planes and reading military history books. Her father, a Vietnam veteran, had initially been skeptical when she announced her intention to join the Army. "It's a different world out there, sweetheart," he'd said, concern creasing his weathered face. "Are you sure you're ready for what they'll throw at you?" But Sarah was determined. She'd excelled at West Point, graduating in the top 10% of her class. Her tactical training scores were among the highest recorded, and her leadership evaluations were stellar. Yet none of that seemed to matter to the men she now commanded. To them, she was just another token officer, someone promoted to fill a quota rather than earn her rank. Major Richardson, the base commander, greeted her with a firm handshake but distant eyes. He was a career soldier, gray-haired and battle-tested with 3 tours under his belt. "Welcome to Phoenix, Captain Chen," he said formally. "I trust you'll find your accommodations adequate." The briefing room was stuffy and filled with cigarette smoke despite regulations. Sarah took her place among the other officers, noting how conversations died when she entered. Lieutenant Jackson, a cocky 25-year-old from Texas, didn't even try to hide his smirk. "So, Captain," he drawled during the tactical planning session, "what's your experience with real combat operations?" The question was loaded, designed to expose what he assumed was her inexperience. Sarah met his gaze steadily. "2 tours in Iraq, Lieutenant. Fallujah and Ramadi. I've led 37 successful missions with 0 casualties under my command." The room fell silent. She hadn't raised her voice or shown any emotion, but her words carried weight. Still, the skepticism remained. Over the following weeks, Sarah threw herself into understanding every aspect of the base's operations. She studied patrol routes, analyzed intelligence reports, and spent hours in the communication center, learning the radio protocols. She made it a point to know every soldier under her command personally, their backgrounds, their families, their fears. Private Rodriguez, barely 19 and on his first deployment, was homesick and struggling with the heat. Sarah spent time teaching him desert survival techniques her grandfather had learned in World War II. Corporal Williams, a medic from Detroit, was dealing with the stress of treating wounded civilians. Sarah listened without judgment and helped him process the emotional toll of his job. Slowly, some of the soldiers began to warm up to her. They saw that she didn't ask them to do anything she wouldn't do herself. When the water purification system broke down, Sarah was right there with her sleeves rolled up helping to fix it. When night watch duties needed to be assigned, she took the worst shifts without complaint. But the real test came during a routine patrol in the villages surrounding the base. Sarah was leading a convoy of 3 Humvees through a narrow mountain pass when they encountered a group of local children blocking the road. It seemed innocent enough. Kids often approached military vehicles hoping for candy or small gifts. Something felt wrong to Sarah, though. The children were too organized, too purposeful in their positioning. She'd studied insurgent tactics extensively and knew that civilian shields were a common strategy. Her instincts, honed through years of training and combat experience, screamed danger. "Hold position," she radioed to the other vehicles. "Something's not right here." Lieutenant Jackson's voice crackled over the radio, impatient and condescending. "They're just kids, Captain. We're burning daylight here." But Sarah trusted her gut. She dismounted from her vehicle and approached the children carefully, speaking to them in the basic Dari she'd been learning. Their responses were rehearsed, mechanical. One boy, maybe 10 years old, kept glancing nervously toward a cluster of rocks about 50 meters away. That's when she spotted the glint of metal, the barrel of an RPG launcher positioned behind the rocks. Her blood ran cold. This was a classic ambush setup, using the children as bait to get the convoy into the perfect kill zone. RPG. Take cover, Sarah shouted, diving behind her Humvee as the first rocket-propelled grenade screamed over their heads. The explosion shook the ground and sent debris raining down around them. More shots rang out from concealed positions along the ridgeline. The convoy was pinned down, caught in a devastating crossfire. Sarah's radio crackled with panicked voices as her soldiers scrambled for cover. She could see muzzle flashes from at least 6 different positions, indicating a well-planned and coordinated attack. "Rodriguez, are you hit?" she called out, seeing the young private clutching his arm. "Just a graze, ma'am," he replied, though his face was pale with shock. Sarah's mind raced, calculating angles, distances, and tactical options. They needed to move, but the killing field ahead offered little cover. Behind them, the narrow pass made retreat nearly impossible. She was going to have to make a decision that would determine whether her soldiers made it home alive. The radio buzzed with Major Richardson's voice from base. "Bravo 6, what's your situation out there?" Sarah keyed her microphone, her voice steady despite the chaos around her. "We're in contact, approximately 15 hostiles in elevated positions, requesting immediate air support and medical evacuation for wounded. Negative on air support, Captain. Closest birds are 40 minutes out. You'll have to hold your position. 40 minutes. Sarah looked around at her soldiers, some of whom had doubted her just hours earlier. Now their lives depended on her leadership, her training, and her ability to think clearly under pressure. The real test of her command had begun, and failure wasn't an option. The gunfire intensified as insurgents realized the convoy was trapped. Sarah pressed herself against the armored side of her Humvee, her mind working through tactical options while bullets pinged off the metal around her. She could hear Lieutenant Jackson shouting orders to his squad, but his voice carried a note of panic that she'd never heard before. "Williams, get that saw set up on the ridge," Jackson yelled to the machine gunner. But Williams was already moving to a better position, following Sarah's earlier hand signals rather than the lieutenant's verbal commands. Sarah had noticed something the others missed. The insurgents were firing from fixed positions, which meant they had prepared this ambush site in advance. But prepared positions also meant predictable fields of fire. She'd studied the terrain during their approach and remembered seeing a dry creek bed that curved around the eastern slope of the hill. "Rodriguez," she called out. "Can you move?" The young private nodded, gripping his rifle with his good arm. "Yes, ma'am, where do you need me?" Sarah pointed toward the creek bed. "See that wash? It curves behind their position. Take Williams and Corporal Jensen with you. Give me 15 minutes, then start putting suppressive fire on those rocks from the east side." Lieutenant Jackson overheard and immediately objected. "That's suicide, Captain. They'll be completely exposed crossing that open ground." "Not if we provide covering fire," Sarah replied calmly, "and not if they move during the next RPG attack. The insurgents will reload for approximately 30 seconds after each shot." As if on cue, another rocket-propelled grenade whooshed overhead, exploding harmlessly against the cliff face behind them. Sarah counted silently in her head, timing the reload cycle she'd memorized from intelligence briefings. "Move now," she shouted. Rodriguez, Williams, and Jensen sprinted across the open ground in a zigzag pattern, while Sarah and the remaining soldiers laid down covering fire. The insurgents, focused on reloading and repositioning, didn't notice the flanking maneuver until it was too late. The tactic worked perfectly. Within minutes, Williams had his machine gun positioned to catch the insurgents in a crossfire. The steady hammering of the saw forced the enemy fighters to abandon their carefully prepared positions and seek new cover. But Sarah wasn't finished. She'd been studying the pattern of their radio chatter, and something was bothering her. The attack was too well coordinated, too professional for a random insurgent group. This had all the hallmarks of a larger operation. "Jackson," she called over the noise of gunfire, "get on the radio to base. Tell them this feels like a diversion. They might be planning something bigger." The lieutenant looked at her skeptically. "A diversion? Captain, we've got 15 guys trying to kill us right now. How is this a diversion?" Before Sarah could answer, her radio crackled with an urgent transmission from Forward Operating Base Phoenix. All units, we are under attack. Repeat, Phoenix Base is under attack. Multiple mortars inbound. Possible ground assault from the north." Lieutenant Jackson's face went pale. "How did you know?" "Standard insurgent tactics," Sarah replied, directing fire toward a new muzzle flash. "Pin down the QRF while hitting the main target. We need to finish this fast and get back to help defend the base. The situation had become exponentially more dangerous. Not only were they fighting for their own lives, but their fellow soldiers back at base were under attack and counting on them for reinforcement. Sarah made a decision that went against every conventional military doctrine she'd been taught. "We're going to assault their position directly," she announced. Sergeant Miller, who had been quietly effective throughout the firefight, looked at her in shock. "Ma'am, that's not in the manual. We're supposed to wait for air support." "The manual doesn't account for our base being under simultaneous attack," Sarah replied. "We have superior training, better equipment, and the element of surprise now that we've flanked them." "Rodriguez, how's your arm?" "Good to go, Captain," the young soldier replied, though sweat was beading on his forehead. Sarah outlined her plan quickly. Williams would continue providing suppressive fire from his position, while the rest of the squad bounded forward in teams. The insurgents, caught between two directions of fire and forced from their prepared positions, would have no choice but to withdraw or be overrun. "Remember," Sarah said, checking her weapon, "these guys are fighters, but they're not soldiers. They don't have our discipline or our training. Use that advantage." The assault began with covering fire from Williams's position. Sarah led the first team forward, moving from rock to rock with practiced efficiency. Behind her, she could hear Jackson breathing heavily, his earlier bravado replaced by the focused intensity of combat. The insurgents, realizing their ambush had failed, began a fighting withdrawal up the mountainside. But they were making a critical mistake. They were moving predictably, following the natural terrain features instead of varying their route. Sarah had anticipated this. During her study of the area maps, she'd identified a natural choke point about 200 meters up the slope, where the terrain forced all movement through a narrow gap between two large boulders. "Jensen," she radioed, "take your team wide left. Get to those twin rocks before they do." Corporal Jensen, a veteran of Afghanistan's mountain warfare, immediately understood the tactical advantage. "Roger that, Captain. Moving now, the race was on." Sarah's team pressed forward aggressively while Jensen's squad made a hard climb up the steep western slope. The insurgents, focused on the immediate threat behind them, didn't notice the second team until it was too late. Jensen's soldiers reached the choke point first and set up a hasty ambush. When the retreating insurgents rounded the bend, they found themselves caught in a perfect crossfire with no escape route. The firefight ended quickly after that. Faced with certain destruction, the surviving insurgents threw down their weapons and surrendered. In less than 30 minutes, Sarah had turned a desperate defensive situation into a tactical victory. But there was no time to celebrate. The radio continued to crackle with urgent reports from forward operating base Phoenix. The mortar attack had intensified and ground forces were probing the perimeter defenses. "All right, people," Sarah said, checking her watch. "We need to get back to base. They're counting on us." As they loaded the wounded insurgents into their vehicles for transport, Lieutenant Jackson approached Sarah with a different expression than she'd ever seen from him, one of genuine respect. "Captain," he said quietly, "I owe you an apology. That was some of the finest tactical leadership I've ever witnessed." Sarah nodded curtly. "Save it for later, Lieutenant. Our job isn't finished yet." The convoy raced back toward forward operating base Phoenix, leaving behind the mountain pass where Sarah Chen had proven herself in the crucible of combat. But the real test of her leadership was still ahead, waiting in the smoke and chaos of a base under siege. The horizon glowed orange with fires as Sarah's convoy approached forward operating base Phoenix. Thick black smoke billowed from several buildings and the distinctive whistle of incoming mortars filled the air. The base's defensive perimeter was under intense pressure, with tracers lighting up the darkening sky like deadly fireworks. "Jesus Christ," Lieutenant Jackson muttered from the passenger seat, staring at the chaos ahead. "How are we supposed to get through that?" Sarah was already on the radio, trying to reach Major Richardson. Static filled the airwaves, punctuated by frantic transmissions from various units calling for ammunition, medical support, and reinforcements. Finally, she got through to the command post. "Phoenix Actual, this is Bravo 6 returning to base with captured insurgents and wounded. What's our entry route?" Major Richardson's voice was tense, barely controlled. "Bravo 6, the main gate is compromised. We've lost 2 guard towers and the enemy has machine gun positions covering the approach. You'll have to find another way in." Sarah studied the base layout in her mind, visualizing the terrain she'd memorized during her first weeks at Phoenix. There was a service road on the eastern side, originally built for supply convoys but rarely used due to its exposure to sniper fire from the surrounding hills. "What about the service entrance on the east side?" she asked. "Negative, Captain. That road is completely exposed. It would be suicide." But Sarah was already calculating odds and alternatives. The main assault on the base was clearly coming from the north and west, where the terrain provided the best cover for attacking forces. The eastern approach might be exposed, but it was also likely to be lightly defended by the insurgents. "Sir, I think the eastern route is our best option. The enemy is focused on their main assault. They won't be expecting a flanking move from that direction." There was a pause before Richardson's voice returned, strained with exhaustion. "It's your call, Captain. We need those vehicles and every soldier we can get." Sarah switched to the convoy frequency. "All vehicles, we're taking the eastern service road. Rodriguez, you still good to fight?" "Hoo-ah, Captain," came the reply from the young private, though his voice was tight with pain from his wounded arm. The convoy swung wide around the base perimeter, staying in the dead ground below the ridgeline to avoid detection. Sarah could see muzzle flashes from the hills above, but they were all directed toward the main base defenses. Her gamble appeared to be paying off. As they approached the service road, the true extent of the attack became visible. Dozens of insurgents were positioned in carefully coordinated firing positions, laying down suppressive fire, while mortar teams adjusted their aim. This wasn't a random raid, it was a full-scale assault designed to overrun the base. "Williams," Sarah called over the radio, "when we get to that service road, I need you ready with the saw. We're going to punch through fast and hard." "Roger that, ma'am," Williams replied. The machine gunner had proven himself during the earlier firefight, and Sarah trusted his judgment completely. The convoy reached the service road and immediately came under fire from a small insurgent position overlooking the approach. But Sarah had expected this, and her soldiers were ready. Williams opened up with the saw, while the other vehicles provided covering fire, quickly suppressing the enemy position. They raced up the exposed road, engines roaring and dust clouds marking their approach. Sarah could hear bullets striking the armored plating of her Humvee, but the vehicles held together. Within minutes they reached the eastern gate of Forward Operating Base Phoenix. The scene inside the base was chaotic. Medical teams were treating wounded soldiers in the open, using whatever cover they could find. Ammunition handlers ran between fighting positions, resupplying the defenders. The command post, partially collapsed from a direct mortar hit, was operating out of sandbag-reinforced bunkers. Major Richardson emerged from the improvised command center, his uniform torn and his face blackened with smoke. "Captain Chen, am I glad to see you? We're taking heavy casualties and running low on ammunition." Sarah quickly assessed the tactical situation. The base was under attack from 3 directions, with the heaviest pressure coming from the north, where a large insurgent force was attempting to breach the perimeter. The defenders were spread thin, trying to cover too much ground with too few soldiers. "Sir, what's our current strength?" she asked, while directing her soldiers to offload the wounded insurgents at the medical station. 47 effective soldiers, including your team," Richardson replied. "We started with 68 this morning." The numbers were grim, but Sarah had fought in worse situations. The key was to concentrate their limited forces at the point of greatest threat and use superior tactics to overcome the enemy's numerical advantage. "Where's Lieutenant Colonel Morrison?" Sarah asked, referring to the base's second-in-command. Richardson's face darkened. "Kay in the first mortar barrage. Direct hit on the motor pool while he was organizing the vehicle defenses. The loss of the executive officer was a severe blow, both tactically and psychologically. Morrison had been a respected leader, and his death would affect the morale of every soldier on the base." "Sir," Sarah said carefully, "what are your orders?" Major Richardson looked around at the chaos, his eyes showing the strain of command under impossible circumstances. For a moment he seemed frozen by the weight of responsibility and the magnitude of the threat they faced. That's when Sarah realized something that would change everything. The man who had dismissed her as a token officer, who had questioned her experience and credentials, was struggling under pressure in a way she had never seen before. His hands were shaking slightly and his breathing was shallow and rapid. We need to..." Richardson started, then stopped, staring at the smoke rising from the burning buildings. Sarah had seen this before in Iraq. Combat stress reaction, sometimes called shell shock in earlier wars. It could happen to anyone, regardless of rank or experience. The constant pressure, the losses, and the responsibility of command had overwhelmed the major's ability to make clear decisions. "Sir," she said gently but firmly, "I recommend we consolidate our forces at the North Wall. That's where they're trying to break through." Richardson nodded absently, but it was clear he wasn't processing the tactical situation. The burden of command had become too heavy for him to bear, and every second of indecision was costing them precious time and possibly lives. Sarah made a decision that went beyond military protocol. She couldn't officially take command from Richardson, but she could lead by example and hope the other soldiers would follow. The lives of 47 soldiers depended on someone taking decisive action. "Jackson," she called to the lieutenant, "get your squad to the North Wall. Williams, set up that saw to cover the main approach. Rodriguez, despite your wound, I need you coordinating ammunition resupply." The soldiers immediately began moving to follow her orders, instinctively recognizing the voice of command and authority. Major Richardson didn't object or countermand her instructions. He simply stood in the command post, overwhelmed by the situation unfolding around him. Sarah keyed her radio and began coordinating the base's defense, her voice calm and professional despite the chaos. "All units, this is Bravo 6. Consolidate defensive positions on the north perimeter. We're going to make our stand there." The real test of her leadership was about to begin, not just proving herself to soldiers who had doubted her, but taking effective command of a desperate situation when the official commander had frozen under pressure. Everything she had learned, everything she had trained for, would be put to the ultimate test in the next few hours. The convoy raced back toward Forward Operating Base Phoenix, leaving behind the mountain pass where Sarah Chen had proven herself in the crucible of combat. But the real test of her leadership was still ahead, waiting in the smoke and chaos of a base under siege. As darkness fell over Forward Operating Base Phoenix, Sarah moved between defensive positions, checking on her soldiers and adjusting their deployment. The enemy had pulled back temporarily, probably regrouping for a final assault under cover of night. The brief lull gave her precious time to organize a proper defense. "Sergeant Miller," she called to the NCO who had initially questioned her leadership, "I need you to take a team and gather all the spare ammunition we can find. Check the damaged buildings too, there might be supplies we can still use." Miller nodded without hesitation. "Yes, ma'am." "Should we check the armory?" "Negative. That building took a direct mortar hit and the structure isn't safe." Sarah had already assessed the damage during her reconnaissance of the base, but the supply depot on the east side might still have crates of small arms ammunition. The transformation in the soldiers' attitudes was remarkable. Men who had whispered about her being a diversity hire just days earlier were now hanging on her every word, recognizing competent leadership when their lives depended on it. Private Rodriguez approached, his wounded arm in a makeshift sling but his eyes alert. "Captain, I've got the ammunition distribution organized. Each fighting position has enough rounds for sustained contact, with reserves positioned for quick resupply." "Outstanding work, Rodriguez," Sarah replied. "How's the arm holding up?" The young soldier managed a grin despite the pain. "Doc says I'll live to complain about the food tomorrow, ma'am." Sarah smiled briefly at his attempt at humor, but her attention was already shifting to the next problem. The base's communications equipment had been damaged in the mortar attack, limiting their ability to call for air support or reinforcements. They were essentially on their own until sunrise. She found Lieutenant Jackson examining a damaged section of the perimeter wall, where insurgent fire had blown a hole in the concrete barriers. His earlier panic had been replaced by focused professionalism. "What's the situation here, Lieutenant?" she asked. "The breach is about 3 meters wide," Jackson reported. "I've got 2 soldiers with overlapping fields of fire, but if they concentrate their assault here, we might not be able to hold." Sarah studied the gap, calculating angles and defensive positions. The breach was indeed a vulnerable point, but it could also be turned into a trap for attacking insurgents. "I want you to pull your men back about 20 meters from the breach," she instructed. "Set up a kill zone with crossfire from both flanks. When they come through that hole, we'll let the first few get inside, then cut them off from their support." Jackson looked uncertain. "Ma'am, that's awfully risky. If we can't stop them." "We will stop them," Sarah said with quiet confidence. "Trust the plan. Trust your soldiers and trust your training. As Jackson moved to reposition his squad, Sarah heard footsteps behind her. She turned to find Major Richardson approaching, his face pale but his eyes more focused than they'd been earlier. "Captain," he said quietly, "I need to speak with you privately." They walked to a sheltered area behind the command bunker away from the other soldiers. Richardson looked older than his 45 years, the stress of command having aged him visibly in just a few hours. "I want to thank you for taking charge back there," he began, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "When Morrison was killed, when those mortars started falling, I couldn't think clearly. All I could see were the faces of the soldiers I might lose." Sarah listened without judgment. She had seen strong leaders falter under extreme pressure before, and she understood the psychological weight that came with command responsibility. "Sir, you've been under incredible stress," she replied. "Combat fatigue affects everyone differently." "There's no shame in—" "There is shame, Captain," Richardson interrupted. "I'm the commanding officer. These soldiers depend on me to lead them, and I failed them when they needed me most." "You didn't fail them, sir. You recognized that someone else was better positioned to handle the tactical situation, and you allowed that to happen. That takes wisdom and humility." Richardson was quiet for a moment, staring at the smoke still rising from damaged buildings. "I've been thinking about what you said earlier, about this being a diversion. You were right. This whole attack was designed to pin down our forces while they hit something else." Sarah had been wondering about the same thing. The attack was too elaborate, too well coordinated to be just about overrunning one small forward operating base. "What do you think their real target is?" she asked. "The supply convoy," Richardson replied grimly. "A major resupply column is scheduled to transit through this area tomorrow morning. Food, fuel, ammunition, and medical supplies for 3 bases in the region. If they capture or destroy that convoy, the implications were staggering. Hundreds of soldiers at remote outposts would be left without critical supplies, potentially for weeks. The insurgents hadn't just planned an attack on forward operating Base Phoenix. They had engineered a strategic blow against the entire regional military operation. "We need to warn the convoy," Sarah said. "I've been trying to reach regional command for the past hour," Richardson replied. "Our long-range communications are down, and the convoy is maintaining radio silence for security reasons. They won't know about the threat until it's too late." Sarah felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. Not only did she need to defend the base and protect the soldiers under her command, but potentially hundreds of other lives hung in the balance. "What time is the convoy scheduled to pass through?" she asked. 0600 hours, approximately 8 kilometers north of here." Sarah checked her watch. It was nearly midnight, which meant they had about 6 hours to find a way to warn the convoy or eliminate the insurgent threat entirely. "Sir," she said carefully, "I have an idea, but it's going to require taking a significant risk." Richardson looked at her with renewed interest. "I'm listening." "The insurgents are expecting us to hunker down and wait for relief. They're not expecting an offensive operation. If we could launch a surprise attack on their main position, we might be able to disrupt their entire operation." "With 47 soldiers against a force that's probably 3 times our size?" Richardson asked. "That's not a risk, Captain, that's suicide." "Not if we do it right," Sarah insisted. "We have better training, better equipment, and night vision capabilities they don't possess. Most importantly, we have the element of surprise." Richardson was quiet, considering the proposal. Sarah could see him wrestling with the decision, weighing the lives of his soldiers against the potential consequences of inaction. "What exactly are you proposing?" he asked finally. Sarah outlined her plan quickly. A small force would remain to defend the base while the majority of their soldiers launched a pre-dawn assault on the insurgent positions. They would use their night vision advantage to close distance undetected, then strike fast and hard before the enemy could mount an effective response. "It's audacious," Richardson admitted, "and it goes against every principle of defensive warfare I've ever learned." "Sometimes audacious is what works," Sarah replied. "The insurgents have planned for us to react defensively. They haven't planned for us to take the fight to them." A mortar round exploded somewhere in the distance, reminding them both that time was running out. The insurgents were still out there, preparing for their final assault on the base and positioning themselves to ambush the morning convoy. Richardson looked at Sarah with an expression she hadn't seen before, complete trust and confidence in her judgment. "All right, Captain," he said. "It's your operation. What do you need?" At 0200 hours, Sarah crouched in the darkness beyond the base perimeter, her night vision goggles revealing the landscape in eerie green detail. Behind her, 32 soldiers moved silently through the rocky terrain, their faces painted with camouflage and their weapons ready for the most dangerous mission of their military careers. She had left 15 soldiers behind to defend the base, including the wounded and those manning the critical communication equipment. Major Richardson had volunteered to remain behind, coordinating the defense and attempting to re-establish contact with regional command. It was a skeleton crew, but it would have to be enough. "Bravo team in position," Lieutenant Jackson's voice whispered through her earpiece. He had proven himself during the earlier firefight and earned the right to lead one of the assault teams. "Charlie team ready," reported Sergeant Miller, who had completely shed his initial skepticism about Sarah's leadership. Sarah checked her watch. They had identified 3 main insurgent positions based on muzzle flashes and radio intercepts during the earlier battle. The plan was to hit all 3 simultaneously, using surprise and superior night fighting capabilities to overcome the enemy's numerical advantage. "All teams. This is Bravo 6, she whispered into her radio. "Remember, we go in fast and hard, suppress their positions, capture any intelligence you can find, and be ready to withdraw on my signal. These guys are fighters, but they're not prepared for a night assault by trained soldiers." The landscape around Forward Operating Base Phoenix was a maze of rocky outcroppings and dried creek beds, perfect terrain for guerrilla warfare. During daylight, the insurgents had used this terrain to their advantage, moving unseen between firing positions. But at night, with their thermal imaging and night vision equipment, Sarah's soldiers had the upper hand. Private Rodriguez, despite his wounded arm, had insisted on joining the assault team. "I didn't come this far to miss the big show," he had argued when Sarah tried to leave him behind. She had finally agreed, assigning him to her command team where she could keep an eye on him. The first target was a mortar position approximately 800 meters north of the base. Intelligence gathered from the captured insurgents indicated it was manned by a crew of 6 fighters, with at least 12 mortar rounds remaining. Eliminating this position was critical. Those mortars posed the greatest threat to both the base and the approaching supply convoy. Sarah's team moved through the darkness like ghosts, using every piece of cover and concealment the terrain offered. Her soldiers had trained for night operations extensively, but this was different. This was real combat against an enemy that knew the terrain intimately and had already proven their tactical competence. "Contact. 200 meters, Rodriguez whispered, pointing toward a cluster of rocks where his sharp eyes had spotted movement. Through her night vision goggles, Sarah could see 2 insurgent sentries positioned to watch the approaches to the mortar position. They were alert and well-positioned, but they were looking for threats from the wrong direction. Sarah hand-signaled for her team to split up. Williams would circle around to the east with his machine gun, while she and Rodriguez approached from the west. The plan was to neutralize the sentries silently, then assault the main position before the mortar crew could react. The approach took nearly 20 minutes of careful movement through rocky terrain. Sarah's heart pounded as she closed the distance to the first sentry, a young insurgent fighter who couldn't have been much older than Rodriguez. She had trained for this moment countless times, but taking a life in close combat was never easy. The sentry never knew what hit him. Sarah's training took over, muscle memory from years of practice combining with the adrenaline of combat. Within seconds, both sentries had been neutralized and her team was in position to assault the mortar position. "Alpha team in position," she radioed quietly, "beginning assault in 30 seconds. The mortar crew was completely unprepared for a night attack. They had positioned themselves in a natural bowl between several large rocks, an excellent defensive position against conventional attack, but a death trap when enemy soldiers appeared above them with night vision equipment. The firefight lasted less than 2 minutes. Sarah's soldiers had every advantage: surprise, superior equipment, and better training. When the shooting stopped, the mortar position had been completely neutralized along with its stockpile of ammunition. "Bravo team." "Report," Sarah called into her radio. "Second position neutralized," Jackson replied. "We captured a radio and several maps. Looks like intelligence material." "Charlie team successful," Miller added. "Found evidence of a larger operation. There are more insurgent groups in the area than we thought." The information was disturbing but not entirely surprising. The sophistication of the attack on Forward Operating Base Phoenix had suggested a larger organizational structure behind it. The insurgents weren't just a local group. They were part of a coordinated regional operation. All teams, begin withdrawal to Rally Point Alpha, Sarah ordered. But as her soldiers began moving back toward the predetermined meeting point, Sarah's radio crackled with an urgent transmission from Major Richardson at the base. Bravo 6, we've got a problem. Our remaining communications equipment just picked up insurgent radio traffic. There's a fourth group we didn't know about, and they're moving to intercept the supply convoy ahead of schedule. Sarah felt her stomach drop. The convoy wasn't supposed to transit the area until dawn, but apparently the schedule had been moved up due to security concerns. That meant dozens of supply trucks loaded with critical materials were heading directly into an ambush, and there was no way to warn them. What's their estimated position? She asked, already calculating distances and time factors in her head. Approximately 6 kilometers north of your current position, moving south on the main supply route. The convoy should reach their position in about 90 minutes. Sarah looked around at her soldiers, exhausted from the night assault but still ready to fight. They had successfully eliminated 3 insurgent positions and dealt a significant blow to the enemy's operational capability. The smart thing to do would be to return to base, consolidate their gains, and wait for reinforcements. But Sarah had never been one to take the easy path when lives were at stake. Somewhere out there in the darkness, truck drivers and convoy security teams were heading into a carefully planned ambush. If she did nothing, good soldiers would die and critical supplies would be lost. Rodriguez, she called to the young private. How are you holding up? Despite his wounded arm and the physical exertion of the night assault, Rodriguez managed a tired grin. Ready for whatever comes next, ma'am. Sarah made her decision. All teams change of mission. We have a convoy to save. Lieutenant Jackson's voice came through the radio with obvious concern. Captain, we've been fighting for hours. The men are tired. We're low on ammunition and we don't even know how many insurgents we're facing. I know the risks, Lieutenant, Sarah replied. But if we don't act, that convoy is going to drive straight into an ambush. Are you with me? There was a brief pause before Jackson responded, and when he did, his voice carried the same determination that had gotten them through the night. Yes, ma'am. Where do you need us? Sarah quickly outlined her plan. They would move north toward the main supply route, using the remaining darkness to get into position before the convoy arrived. The insurgent ambush team would be focused on the road, probably positioned in the hills overlooking the most vulnerable section of the route. Our advantage is that they don't know we're coming, she explained to her assembled soldiers. They've spent the night getting their teeth kicked in by us and they're not expecting another assault from a different direction. Sergeant Miller raised a practical concern. Ma'am, if we engage this group, we might not have enough ammunition to fight our way back to base. Then we better make sure we win quickly. Sarah replied with a confidence she didn't entirely feel. The team moved north through the rocky terrain, pushing their physical limits to cover the distance before dawn. Sarah could see the exhaustion in her soldiers' faces, but she could also see their determination. They had started this deployment as skeptics, questioning her authority and competence. Now they were following her into the most dangerous situation of their military careers without hesitation. As they approached the main supply route, the first hints of dawn were beginning to appear on the eastern horizon. Time was running out. In the distance, Sarah could hear the low rumble of diesel engines. The convoy was approaching. There, Rodriguez whispered, pointing toward a ridgeline overlooking the road. Muzzle flash about 400 meters. Through her night vision equipment, Sarah could see the insurgent positions. They had chosen their ambush site well, a narrow section of road between 2 hills where the convoy would be completely exposed. Machine gun nests controlled the high ground on both sides, with what appeared to be improvised explosive devices positioned along the road itself. How many do you count? She asked Williams, who was scanning the area with his scope. At least 15 fighters that I can see, the machine gunner replied. Probably more in concealed positions. The odds were getting worse by the minute, but Sarah had come too far to turn back now. The convoy was less than 10 minutes away, and once those trucks entered the kill zone, the results would be catastrophic. All right, people, she said quietly. This is what we came for. Jackson, take your team around to the east side. Miller, you're with me on the west. Williams, find a good position with that saw and be ready to provide covering fire. As her soldiers moved into their assault positions, Sarah could hear the convoy getting closer. The sound of heavy trucks grinding through the gears echoed off the canyon walls, a stark reminder of how little time they had left. She keyed her radio one last time before the assault began. All teams, remember what we're fighting for. Those are our people in those trucks, and they're counting on us to bring them home safe. The first truck of the convoy appeared around the bend in the road just as Sarah's assault teams reached their positions. She could see the lead vehicle clearly through her scope, a heavily armored transport followed by a long line of supply trucks carrying everything from ammunition to medical supplies. The drivers had no idea they were heading into a carefully planned ambush. 30 seconds until the convoy enters the kill zone, she whispered into her radio. All teams prepare to engage on my signal. The insurgents were perfectly positioned for their ambush. Sarah could see fighters adjusting their weapons, preparing to unleash devastating fire on the exposed convoy. In just moments, the lead truck would trigger the improvised explosive devices, and the entire convoy would be trapped in a narrow canyon with no escape route. Execute. Execute, execute, Sarah commanded. Williams opened up with his machine gun from an elevated position, raking the insurgent positions with accurate fire. Simultaneously, Jackson's team assaulted the eastern ridgeline, while Sarah led her soldiers up the western slope. The insurgents, caught completely by surprise, scrambled to respond to threats from multiple directions. The sound of gunfire echoed through the canyon as Sarah's soldiers pressed their attack. She could see muzzle flashes from insurgent weapons, but their fire was wild and uncoordinated. They had been prepared for an ambush, not for a coordinated assault by professional soldiers. "Rodriguez, stay close," Sarah shouted as they bounded forward from rock to rock. Despite his wounded arm, the young private was keeping pace with the rest of the team, his rifle ready and his eyes alert. The convoy below had stopped when the firefight erupted, but they were still in the danger zone. Sarah could see soldiers jumping from the trucks, taking whatever cover they could find while trying to figure out what was happening. "Convoy leader, this is Bravo 6, Sarah called over the radio, hoping the convoy's communication equipment was tuned to the standard military frequencies. "You are in an ambush zone. Reverse course immediately and withdraw to safe distance." The lead truck immediately began backing up, followed by the rest of the convoy. The drivers, though surprised by the sudden firefight, were following their training and getting their vehicles out of the kill zone as quickly as possible. But the insurgents weren't giving up easily. Sarah could see fighters moving to new positions, trying to get a clear shot at the retreating convoy. One insurgent with an RPG launcher was setting up behind a large boulder, aiming directly at the lead truck. "RPG gunner, 2 o'clock, she shouted to Williams. The machine gunner shifted his fire, sending a burst of rounds that forced the RPG gunner to take cover. But there were too many targets and not enough soldiers to cover them all. Sarah realized they needed to take more aggressive action. "Jackson, can you get your team to that ridge?" she called, pointing to a higher position that would give them better fields of fire. "On it, Captain," Jackson replied, leading his soldiers in a dangerous assault up the steep rocky slope. Sarah watched with pride as Lieutenant Jackson, who had questioned her leadership just days earlier, displayed the kind of tactical competence and courage that would make any commander proud. His team moved with precision and determination, using fire and movement techniques to advance under pressure. The battle turned when Jackson's team reached the high ground. From their elevated position, they could see and engage insurgent fighters who had been hidden from the other assault teams. The crossfire became devastating, forcing the insurgents to abandon their carefully prepared positions. "They're breaking contact," Sergeant Miller reported. "Enemy forces withdrawing to the north." Sarah could see insurgent fighters running through the rocks, abandoning their weapons and equipment in their haste to escape. The ambush had been completely disrupted and the convoy was safe. "All teams cease fire and consolidate positions," she ordered. "Check for casualties and gather any intelligence materials you can find." As the shooting died down, Sarah took a moment to survey the battlefield. Her soldiers had fought brilliantly, overcoming superior numbers and difficult terrain through superior training and tactics. More importantly, they had saved the lives of dozens of convoy personnel and prevented the loss of critical supplies. Rodriguez approached her, grinning despite the exhaustion and pain from his wounded arm. "Ma'am, we did it. The convoy is safe." "We did it together, Rodriguez," Sarah replied. Every single soldier on this team contributed to this victory. The aftermath of the battle revealed the true scope of the insurgent operation. Intelligence materials found at the ambush site showed detailed plans for coordinated attacks on multiple military targets throughout the region. The assault on Forward Operating Base Phoenix had indeed been part of a much larger strategy. Lieutenant Jackson approached with a captured radio and several maps. "Captain, this is bigger than we thought. They were planning to hit 3 different bases and intercept 2 separate convoy routes. This was just the beginning." Sarah studied the captured materials, understanding the strategic implications. By disrupting this operation, they had potentially saved hundreds of lives and prevented a major blow to military operations in the region. As the sun rose fully over the Afghan mountains, casting golden light across the battlefield, Sarah's radio crackled with a transmission from Forward Operating Base Phoenix. "Bravo 6, this is Phoenix Actual." Major Richardson's voice was clear and strong, the hesitation and uncertainty of the previous night completely gone. "Regional Command has re-established communications. Relief forces are en route, ETA 30 minutes. The ordeal was finally over." Sarah looked around at her soldiers, dirty, exhausted, but victorious. They had started this deployment as a group of individuals, many of whom had doubted her leadership and questioned her presence among them. They were ending it as a cohesive team that had faced impossible odds and emerged triumphant. When they returned to Forward Operating Base Phoenix, word of their actions had already spread throughout the military network. The woman who had been dismissed as a token officer had led one of the most successful tactical operations in the region's recent history. Major Richardson met them at the base entrance, his command presence fully restored. "Captain Chen," he said formally, then broke into a smile. "That was exceptional leadership under the most difficult circumstances I've ever witnessed." Months later, back in the United States, Sarah stood in a Pentagon ceremony room as a general, pinned the silver star to her uniform. In the audience sat Rodriguez, his arm fully healed, and Lieutenant Jackson, who had become one of her strongest supporters. Major Richardson, now recovered from his combat stress, had written the recommendation for her medal personally. The citation read in part, "Captain Chen's exceptional courage, tactical brilliance, and inspirational leadership under fire saved numerous lives and prevented a strategic defeat. Her actions exemplify the highest traditions of military service." But for Sarah, the real victory had been earning the respect and trust of the soldiers she led. She had proven that leadership wasn't about gender, politics, or quotas. It was about competence, courage, and the ability to make hard decisions when lives hung in the balance. The young woman from Ohio who had always been different, who had faced skepticism and prejudice throughout her military career, had finally found her place, not as a token or a symbol, but as a soldier and a leader who had earned her rank through blood, sweat, and the crucible of combat. As she looked out at the audience during the medal ceremony, Sarah thought about the lessons learned in the mountains of Afghanistan. Sometimes the greatest battles aren't against external enemies, but against the assumptions and prejudices that limit what people believe is possible. And sometimes, when everything is on the line, the person others dismiss as the least likely to succeed becomes exactly the leader everyone needs.